So do you say something about the
Hi,
the microphones were switched up?
this is the hot seat.
Hi folks, welcome to the hot seat. This is a special edition. Cassandra Harris Lockwood is of course still here and she's still on the throne. This is not Denmark. We have not replaced our queen, but because this is Martin Luther King Day, and you know, every time I'm on this show, I always like the questions that I ask her better than ones that she asked me. You know, I like to ask people questions. I'm a journalist and a reporter, and today is Martin Luther King Day. So I thought I had this idea that instead of her interviewing me, perhaps I could interview you, Cassandra, since you lived throughout the time of the civil rights.
I did.
Civil rights era, the Martin Luther King era. So what we're mostly talking about here, at the time of this activity in the movement was in the 1960s, and to put it into context, in the 1960s, from 60 to 68, you were in high school, transitioning to college age, teen becoming in your 20s.
Powerful period of time for me.
And how old were you?
Well, in 60, I was born in 51, so do the math.
Right, so you would have really good memory of that time.
Absolutely, and it was formative. These were formative years.
How?
It was a different time then, obviously. And being a black girl in upstate New York was a time of discovery. I mean, it's a time of discovery for any young person, to go from a tween into your college years, But the 60s were particularly unique. It's just incredibly unique. It was just such, we went from an awareness of how dangerous it was to be black. I mean, but that's just the way it was. You grew up with an understanding that things like this Emmett Till boy had happened.
Right.
I mean, I was a child. I mean, I was old enough to understand this was a really, really bad thing that happened to this black boy.
Because he was black.
Because he was black. And when we would travel, and we did travel, we mostly traveled at night as a family. And
Why is that?
Well, because you couldn't stay at every place that was, along the way.
Right, there was the whole Green Book thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But we didn't stop. Mom would drive, and then Dad would drive, into the night. And Dad looked pretty white, so it was not as we didn't. I don't ever remember being pulled over. But just the.
But the thought of just going to a motel or a hotel.
Oh, we didn't even think about that. We didn't even consider that.
Yeah.
No. Maybe would stop at someone's house on the way.
Right.
And back in those days, they did things like have rooming houses, and then they had the Green Book where you could check and find out.
So the Green Book was a directory that black people would use that would list places that were safe for lodging or for food or to stop and get gas.
It was understood. That if you went to a certain place in the South. Right. That literally crossed a line. Yeah. That you could not go in and sit down and order food. You could not buy things from certain stores. Yeah. You couldn't take books out at libraries.
Really?
Oh yeah.
I wasn't aware.
Oh yeah. And if you were in the South, if you went to a department store, you couldn't try on clothes. You couldn't try on a hat. These were. These things were understood.
Well, what about up here? Was it like that here?
No, well, there were some, there were not restrictions like that. There were more cultural understanding.
Places you weren't welcome, and you knew that.
Yep. Yeah. And when my parents first came here in '54, black people didn't walk up and down on Genesee Street.
Really?
Oh no. And
why is that?
Well, because we weren't welcome. We weren't welcome.
Really?
And it was the culture made it really clear that you weren't welcome. Yeah. I mean, the mills that made Utica so powerful back in the late 1800s and early 1900s never hired black people. So I mean, there were places you just didn't go.
Right.
You didn't go to. You didn't bother to go there to get a job or to be waited on or anything like that.
Now, did you have any experiences like that yourself, or were there times
Well,
you could think of when you opted not to pursue something or not to go into a store?
No,
because of that?
personally no. But when as a child, it was fairly common to be called the N-word.
Really?
Yeah, and and then you had to, if depending on who was calling you out, you had to suck it up, or But on my own age group, it was going to school. One of the conversations before we went to school was if anybody calls you a nigger, then first of all you respect your elders, you respect your teachers, respect the clergy, they're next to God. But if anybody calls you a nigger, you punch them in the nose.
Yeah.
So there was this.
What kind of conversations did your parents have with you about being black and about being a black person in such an, like, you lived in Marcy, right?
Well, we didn't start off in
overwhelmingly
Marcy.
white.
My dad was one of the first, if not the first, black engineer that GE hired up here. We came. He hired us. He was hired in Schenectady right out of college, and that's where we were. But they immediately transferred him. He was going back and forth between Utica and Schenectady for I don't know, a year. I don't know how long. And staying in a boarding house. Again, this was a common practice.
Right.
You had boarding houses. And a lot of musicians, when they would come to town, because they couldn't stay in the Hotel Utica or
Right.
the Hotel Hamilton or whatever, there were boarding houses that would take these musicians and stuff, other people. But so when we came, I wrote this all up at some point. It's in the Phoenix, but the housing challenges. Housing was the biggest thing.
For your family?
Well, for black families.
Yeah.
And the Jews were the first ones that were willing to rent or even to sell to black people.
Oh, nice.
But when it came to that, after the 40s, after the war and the GI Bill and all this money going into these former GIs to buy houses, that was when the housing booms came. That's when these ticky-tacky houses went up and
the Levitt towns and the
yes,
suburbs
absolutely.
and,
Specs development, this development, that development.
Right.
Black people. Actually, my father bought a plot, and they built all around it, and not his plot. And then when he went,
Where was that?
That one was in Whitesboro, but they call it Nigger Road.
Wow.
Oh yeah, they called it Nigger Road, because
your
my
family
father
lived
bought on that place. And they didn't want that was it was a whole deal. I mean,
Right.
you could read
So
about.
what happened with that though?
The guy gave my father, the $5. There was a clause in there. There were clauses in the property deeds in this area, well, all over New York State, that would say that you could not sell to a person of color. And it's funny. There's part of me that really wants to say that a lot of the immigrants that come here that are of color, that had never experienced any of this cultural distortion, and it was a distortion. It was woven into the fabric, so you didn't even get a feel for it. It's just the way it was.
Right.
They don't get it.
Yeah.
They don't get it, and they don't get how. You would, don't take it personal. Well, I'm sorry. It's really hard not to take it personal when you're the one at the short end of the stick.
Right.
But so you were asking me about how these things impacted. And then the difference that Martin Luther King made. We were buffeted. You're buffeted from every angle, every portion of your life. But that's just the way it was in America. And so then this guy comes along. We were hearing about sit-ins, and as an 8-year-old, I was hearing about sit-ins. And every night on the news, there'd be some. Well, it got into the 60s. That you would see some horrific scene of black people sitting peacefully, rocking back and forth, singing "We Shall," blah blah blah, getting clubbed over the head, getting dogs sicked on them, and
fire hoses.
Yeah, fire hoses. I mean, and do we see clips of it today? This was a steady diet.
Yeah.
So you'd see this stuff at night,
Right.
And then you go to this school, you know, where you're like, you're the only black kid there.
Yeah.
And there are other kids that saw it, and well, I don't know if they were watching the news.
But they
I don't
probably
know.
had some awareness.
They
of
had
what was
some
going
awareness,
on.
you know, and there had to been some commentary at the table, you know.
Oh yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
this is before CNN and
Yeah,
MSNBC.
right.
You know, you had
Yeah.
CBS, NBC, and ABC.
Yep.
But the point I want to make is that there was this space, there was this distance, you know, and there's like an embarrassment. There was an embarrassment, you know, that
What
I
was
was.
the embarrassment?
Well, because people that looked like me were being so set upon,
Right. Right.
and it was an obvious event. It was an obvious way of being. It was
Right.
it was the way that our culture was. But and there were some kids that would you know, call me bad names.
Yeah.
And it happened on the first day of school at Marcy Elementary.
Really.
Oh yeah, the
Yeah.
biggest kid in the class. You know, I had moved from you know, St. Joseph's up to Marcy Elementary. And I probably should wait till we come back from the commercial to tell the story,
okay.
because
Well,
it's
we're
really
going to
it's a
a
cool little
commercial.
commercial.
Well,
But
that'll be
we have
great.
another minute. But
Right.
the point being is that it was okay in America to insult black people.
Right.
It was, you know, and if you had a champion, or if you had a hero, or if you had an ally, that was one thing.
Yeah.
But in a classroom as a, you know, 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, and you're the only one there.
And a girl too.
And a girl.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a girl. I forgot about that part.
Yeah.
Because
Well, I mean,
at that point, it really
if
didn't
there
matter.
were, no, but I mean, like if there were, you know, boys were really big.
Yeah, and it was
It's
a big boy.
consideration.
It was a big boy. But you know what? We're going to go to commercial, and I'll
Okay,
tell the whole
folks,
story.
also more
when we come
questions
back.
for Cassandra. This is
Yeah.
our special Martin Luther
Okay,
King Day
thank you.
edition
Thank you for
of the
this.
hot seat.
Ron, I think you
Stay
this. Yeah.
tuned.
Attention.